My daughter demanded my wedding ring for her wedding, but when my toxic mother-in-law interfered and turned her against me, I cut off financial support, and the truth that came out left us all speechless. I'm 48 years old. I've been a widow for 4 years, and I work as a baker in my own business that I inherited from my parents. I need to tell this story because what happened with my daughter Madeline almost a year ago kept me up at night for months. And even though things worked out in the end, I still struggle to process how a simple request turned into such a family nightmare. I guess I should start by explaining the context a bit, because none of this makes sense without understanding the relationship I always had with my mother-in-law, Florence, or Alice, as everyone calls her, a 72-year-old woman who basically never forgave me for marrying her son, Kenneth. Kenneth and I were married for 22 years before he died 4 years ago from a completely unexpected cardiac arrest. He was 46. I mean, he was still young. And one day, he just collapsed at work, and that was it. Everything was over. There were no signs, no time to prepare, nothing. One day, we were planning to remodel the kitchen, and the next day I was choosing a casket. Madeline was 21 when it happened. You know, a horrible age to lose your father because you're old enough to fully understand what it means, but you still need your parents in a certain way. It was devastating for both of us, honestly. And we spent the first 2 years basically clinging to each other because we didn't have anyone else. Or at least that's what we thought. The thing with Alice is that she never approved of our marriage from the beginning. Kenneth came from a family with money, not millionaires but very comfortable financially, and I was the daughter of bakers from a small town. When Kenneth took me to meet his parents, I think I was about 23 at the time, Alice looked me up and down and literally asked, in front of me, if I was pregnant because she couldn't understand why her son would want to marry me otherwise. Imagine starting a family relationship like that. Years passed and things never really improved. She tolerated my dollar existence because Kenneth adored her and because I gave her 2 grandchildren, Madeline and her older brother Frederick, who's now 28, but I always felt she was waiting for me to mess up somehow, to have the perfect excuse to tell Kenneth to divorce me. When Kenneth died, Alice made a whole spectacle at the funeral about how she had lost her only son, as if Frederick and I didn't exist, as if Madeline hadn't lost her father. I remember she hugged me in front of everyone and whispered in my ear, "Now you don't have to pretend you're part of this family anymore." It was so twisted that for a moment I thought I'd imagined it. But no, she said it seriously. After the funeral, I cut contact with her almost completely. Frederick, bless him, takes care of her because he lives nearby and he's her son too. But I simply couldn't have her in my life. I had enough with my own grief and helping Madeline process hers. The next 4 years were difficult but manageable. You know? The bakery kept me busy. Madeline finished college, met a guy named Adrian who seemed decent. They got engaged after 3 years of dating. Adrian comes from a more modest family, like mine. And I liked that because it meant there wasn't that kind of pretentiousness that Kenneth's family always had. Everything was going well, or at least as well as things could go for a widow trying to rebuild her life. Madeline and I had a good relationship. We talked almost every day. I was excited about the wedding. I had offered to help financially because I know starting a life together is expensive, and I wanted them to have a good start. Then came the day, everything went to hell. Madeline came to my house. I think it was a Sunday, because I remember I was making bread for the week, and she looked nervous but excited. I sat down with her in the kitchen, served her coffee, and she started with this whole introduction about how she and Adrian were planning the wedding and wanted it to be special and have family meaning. I was nodding, thinking she was going to ask me to make the wedding cake or something like that, which I would have been delighted to do. But no. What she said was, "Mom, I want to use Dad's wedding ring as my engagement ring." I froze. I literally couldn't process what I'd just heard for a moment. My wedding ring, the ring Kenneth put on my finger 26 years ago, the ring I haven't taken off a single day since he died, the ring that's basically the only tangible thing connecting me to him. And Madeline wanted me to give it to her so Adrian could put it on her finger when he formally proposed, because apparently the ring Adrian had bought wasn't good enough or didn't have enough history or I don't know what. I looked at her and said, "Honey, that ring is very important to me. I can't give it to you." And she, with a face I'd never seen on her, responded, "But Dad was my father. I also have a right to have something of his. You already had it for 22 years. I tried to explain that I could give her other things of her father's. We had his watch, we had his book collection, We had photos and letters and 1,000 other things, but not the ring. I was keeping that ring. It wasn't negotiable, period. And this is where things got ugly because Madeline started crying and saying I was selfish, that I only thought about myself, that she had also lost her father, and I couldn't hoard all the memories. I told her I understood her pain but that this specific ring was mine, that there were other rings of Kenneth's she could have, but not this one. She left my house furious, slamming the door so hard it made the windows shake. I thought it would pass in a few days, that she'd said it in the heat of the moment and when she calmed down she'd understand. But no, a week passed and Madeline wasn't calling me, wasn't responding to my messages, nothing. And then, like 2 weeks after that conversation, I got a call from a number I didn't have saved but recognized immediately when I heard the voice. Alice. My dearest ex-mother-in-law who hadn't spoken to me directly in 4 years. She called to tell me I was a disgrace. How dare I deny my own daughter something as simple as a ring, that Kenneth would be disappointed in me, that she always knew I wasn't good enough for her family. That's when I realized what had happened. Madeline had run to Alice to tell her version of events, and Alice, being Alice, took advantage of the perfect opportunity to get involved and cause problems. I hung up on her without responding, blocked her immediately, and called Madeline. When she finally answered, I asked her directly if she'd talked to her grandmother about the ring. There was silence, and then she admitted yes. That Alice had called to ask about the wedding plans, and when she told her about the ring, her grandmother said I was being ridiculous and selfish. I said, Madeline, that woman has been waiting years for an excuse to get back into our lives and you just gave it to her. On a silver platter. She got defensive. Started yelling that Alice was just trying to help her. That at least her grandmother understood her unlike her insensitive mother. That conversation ended worse than the first. I told her that if she was going to take Alice's side, a woman who never respected me a single day of her life, then we had a much bigger problem than a ring. Madeline yelled at me that I'd always had problems with Alice, out of jealousy or insecurity, that Alice only wanted what was best for her family, and I responded that Alice never considered me part of her family in the first place. We said horrible things to each other, like things you can't easily take back. And I ended the call by telling her that if that was the path she wanted to take, then she'd have to organize her wedding without my financial help. I know it sounds harsh, and believe me, I felt horrible after saying it, but I was so angry and so hurt that the words came out before I could think them through. I had promised to help her with the wedding. We were talking about a significant contribution because event venues are super expensive in Adrian, and she didn't have much money saved. But I felt that if she was going to ally with Alice against me, then I couldn't pretend I would keep financing everything as if nothing had happened. The truth is that at that moment, I didn't know if I was doing the right thing or if I was being as manipulative as Alice, but I'd already said it and couldn't take it back without losing all credibility. Weeks passed, then months, without Madeline and me talking. Frederick called me a couple of times trying to mediate, telling me he understood my position but that Madeline was young and being influenced by Alice, that I should be the adult in the situation. I told him I was trying to be the adult, but I also had limits, that I couldn't let Alice use my daughter to hurt me again. Frederick would sigh and say he understood, that his mother had always been like that, manipulative and toxic, but she was his mother, and he couldn't just cut her out of his life completely. I told him I could, and I hoped Madeline would eventually realize the mistake she was making. About 5 months into all this, when I'd sort of accepted that maybe Madeline and I would never reconcile, I got a message from her. It wasn't an apology message. It was a desperate message asking for help. Apparently, the venue they'd chosen for the wedding required a deposit of several $1,000s in Adrian, and she didn't have the full amount. They'd been counting on my original contribution, and although they'd tried to get loans or help from Adrian's parents, they'd had no luck. The message basically said, Mom, I know things are bad between us, but I really need your help. If we don't pay the deposit this week, we lose the venue and we'll have to postpone the wedding indefinitely. I stared at that message for hours. Part of me wanted to respond immediately. Yes. That of course. I'd help her because she was my daughter and I loved her no matter what. But another part of me, the part that had been suffering for months because of her rejection and her alliance with Alice, didn't want to give in so easily. I finally responded that we needed to talk in person. She came to my house the next day. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept in days. We sat in the same kitchen where it had all started, and I said, I'm going to help you with the wedding. I'm going to give you the money you need, but I have one non-negotiable condition. Madeline looked at me with hope and terror at the same time. And I continued, I need you to cut contact with your grandmother Alice. Completely. No more calls, no more visits, nothing. That woman has been poisoning our relationship from the beginning, and if we're going to fix this, she can't be in the middle. Madeline started to protest, saying she couldn't ask her to do that Alice was her grandmother. But I interrupted her. I told her, that woman never loved me, never respected my marriage to your father, and now she's using our conflict to hurt me through you. You can choose to have a relationship with me or have a relationship with her, but you can't have both, not while I'm still alive and breathing. It was a harsh ultimatum. I know, but I felt it was necessary. Madeline cried, said it wasn't fair. Why did she have to choose? I explained that Alice had spent decades making me feel inferior, treating me like I wasn't good enough for her son, and that I'd tolerated all of that for Kenneth. But Kenneth was gone, and I had no reason to continue subjecting myself to that abuse. I told her I understood that for her, Alice was just her grandmother who had spoiled her and supported her, but that same woman had made my life impossible for over 20 years. Madeline finally, through tears, agreed. She said she'd cut contact with Alice if it meant I would help her with the wedding, and we could repair our relationship. I gave her the money for the venue deposit, and over the following weeks it seemed like things were improving. Madeline came to the house. We talked about wedding plans. She didn't mention Alice at all. I wanted to believe we'd gotten past the worst, that we could finally get back to having a normal mother-daughter relationship. But then, about 2 months later, Frederick called me worried. He told me Alice had been harassing him, telling him I'd forced Madeline to abandon her, that it was abusive behavior, that he needed to intervene and make Madeline reconsider. Frederick had told her to stay out of it, that it was a matter between Madeline and me, but Alice wouldn't take no for an answer. Sure enough, a few days later I received several messages from an unknown number. It was Alice. She'd gotten another phone or was using someone else's to contact me. The messages said things like, "You can't keep me away from my granddaughter. Kenneth would turn in his grave if he knew what you're doing. You're a manipulator and you always have been." I ignored them and blocked the number, but they kept coming from other numbers. Finally, I decided to unblock Alice from my personal phone and confront her directly. I called her, and when she answered, I said, "Alice, listen to me carefully because I'm only going to say this once. Stop harassing me, stop harassing Frederick, and stop trying to contact Madeline. This is your fault. You turned a normal family disagreement into this nightmare." A brutal argument broke out on the phone. Alice screamed that I'd stolen her son, that I was never a good wife, that I was using Madeline as revenge against her. I yelled back that she'd made my life miserable from the day I met Kenneth, that she'd treated me like trash for more than 2 decades, and that if she lost her relationship with Madeline, it was a direct consequence of her own toxic actions. I told her word for word, "You put your poison in my daughter's head about a ring that's none of your business, and now you're going to live with the consequences." I hung up, shaking with rage. I literally had to sit down because my legs wouldn't support me. I thought that would be enough, that Alice would finally understand she'd crossed a line. But no, this woman is persistent to sickening levels. About 6 months before Madeline's wedding, we were having a family dinner at my house. Frederick had come with his wife and kids. Madeline was there with Adrian. We were all having a good time, laughing, talking about the wedding that was getting close. And then the doorbell rang. I went to open it thinking maybe it was a neighbor or a delivery, and there was Alice, standing at my entrance, with a small suitcase, as if she thought I was going to invite her to stay. I was literally speechless. I hadn't seen her in person in years, and there she was, at my door, uninvited, without prior notice. I asked her what she was doing there, and she said, with that fake sweet voice she always used, when she wanted to manipulate someone, "I came to see my granddaughter and meet her fiancé. You can't expect me to miss this." I told her she wasn't welcome in my house and needed to leave immediately. She tried to push past me to get in, literally put her hand on the door and tried to force her way inside, and I had to physically block her. Madeline appeared behind me asking what was happening. Saw her grandmother, and her face fell apart. Alice started this whole dramatic show, crying and saying, "Madeline, my love, your mother won't let me see you. She's keeping me away from you. Don't let her destroy our relationship." Madeline looked at me confused and I said, "I didn't invite her." She showed up unannounced. Frederick came out too, saw the scene, and sighed deeply like saying, "Here we go again," he told Alice. "Mom, you can't do this. You need to leave." Alice turned to him and yelled that he was a traitor, that everyone had abandoned her, that she just wanted to be part of her granddaughter's life. The situation escalated super fast. Alice started shouting accusations, saying I'd poisoned her children against her, that I'd seduced Kenneth to pull him away from his family, that I'd always been a gold digger who just wanted Kenneth's parents' money. Adrian and Frederick's wife were in shock. The kids started crying from the shouting. Madeline tried to calm Alice down, saying, "Grandma, please, don't do this." But Alice was in full hysteria mode. She told Madeline, "Your mother is manipulating you. She's forcing you to choose between us when you shouldn't have to. That's not a loving mother. That's abuse." Frederick finally had to physically grab his mother and remove her from my entrance. She fought, screamed, tried to break free. He took her to her car that was parked on the street, put her suitcase in the trunk, and told her to go home before he called the police. Alice yelled at him that he was a horrible son, that Kenneth would be ashamed of him. All kinds of things designed to hurt. She finally got in her car and left. But before leaving, she rolled down the window and yelled at me, "This isn't over. I'm going to get my granddaughter back." We all went back inside in absolute silence. The kids were still crying. Adrian looked completely traumatized. Frederick's wife was trying to calm everyone down. I was trembling, not from fear but from pure rage. Madeline stood in the middle of the living room staring at the door as if she couldn't process what had just happened. After a moment, she turned to me and said, "Mom, I'd never seen Grandma like that. What was all that?" I said, "That's what I've been tolerating from that woman for decades. That's the person you thought I was imagining or exaggerating." We all sat down. Frederick poured drinks for the adults because we all needed them, and we had a long conversation about Alice. Frederick told stories about how his mother had always been controlling and manipulative, how she'd tried to sabotage his own marriage when his wife didn't meet her expectations, how she'd made horrible comments about me for years that he'd tried to ignore or minimize. Madeline listened to all this with tears rolling down her cheeks, saying over and over, "I didn't know. I didn't know she was like that." I explained it wasn't her fault, that Alice was an expert at showing different faces to different people, that with grandchildren she'd always been loving and generous, but her true nature was toxic and poisonous. That night, after Frederick and his family left, after Adrian went to his apartment, Madeline stayed with me. We sat on the couch, her leaning against me like when she was little, and we had the most honest conversation we'd had in years. She asked me why I'd never told her everything about Alice, and I explained I'd tried to protect her, that Kenneth always defended his mother, and I didn't want to put Madeline in the middle of that dynamic. I told her about the time Alice told me at my own wedding that she didn't expect the marriage to last more than 2 years, about how she commented on my weight every time she saw me, about how she suggested to Kenneth that he get a paternity test when Madeline was born because supposedly I looked too friendly with a bakery employee. Madeline cried a lot that night. She said she felt stupid for trusting Alice, for letting her cause problems between us. I told her she wasn't stupid, that Alice had had a lifetime to perfect her manipulations, that it was understandable that a granddaughter would want to see the best in her grandmother. I asked her about the ring, about why it had been so important to her in the first place. Madeline admitted that part of her just wanted something tangible from her father, but another part had been Alice planting the idea in her head for years, telling her she deserved Kenneth's things as much as I did, that I shouldn't hoard all the memories. That's when I understood that the whole ring conflict hadn't started when Madeline asked me for it. It had started much earlier, with Alice sowing resentment little by little. I told Madeline I understood her pain over losing her father, that I also missed him every day, but that the ring represented something very specific to me: my marriage, my commitment, my life with Kenneth. I offered her other things: the watch Kenneth always wore, some cufflinks her father loved, photos she could frame. Madeline said she didn't need the ring, that what she'd really needed all this time was to feel that her father hadn't completely disappeared from her life. We cried together that night, talked about Kenneth, shared memories we hadn't shared in years. Madeline told me things about her father I didn't know, moments they'd had when she was a teenager, advice Kenneth had given her about life. I told her about how I met her father, about our horrible first date where he took me to a super expensive restaurant and I spilled red wine on my white dress, about how he proposed to me at my parents' bakery, surrounded by cakes and freshly baked bread. We talked until 4 in the morning, and when we finally went to sleep, I felt like I'd gotten my daughter back. The next few months before the wedding were much better. Madeline and I went back to our routine of daily calls. She came to the bakery to help me on weekends like she used to before everything exploded. Alice tried to contact her several times, but Madeline didn't respond. She showed me the messages so I'd know she wasn't hiding anything from me. Frederick kept Alice informed about the wedding plans, but made it very clear she wasn't invited to the event. Alice threatened to show up anyway, to make a scene, but Frederick told her if she did, he'd call the police without hesitation. The week before the wedding, Madeline came to my house with a proposal. She said, "Mom, I know the ring is important to you and I understand why you can't give it to me, but what would you think about me using it just for the ceremony, as something borrowed, and I'll give it back to you immediately after?" It took me by surprise. I'm not going to lie. I thought about it for a moment, about what it would mean to lend her the ring even temporarily, and I realized I could do that. That lending wasn't the same as giving, that I could share that little piece of Kenneth with our daughter on her special day without losing what the ring meant to me. I said yes. Madeline started crying with happiness, hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. She asked me if I was sure like 5 times, and I assured her yes, that it seemed like a beautiful way to have her father present at the ceremony. When I told Frederick about my decision, he got emotional too. He said Kenneth would be proud of both of us, of how we'd found a way to honor his memory without destroying each other in the process. The wedding day was perfect. Madeline looked beautiful. Adrian couldn't stop crying every time he looked at her. The ceremony was intimate and moving. When it came time for the exchange of rings, Madeline wore my wedding ring on her finger along with her own engagement ring. The officiant mentioned that ring had belonged to her parents, that it represented lasting love and commitment, and that Madeline wore it that day as a symbol that her father's love was still present. There wasn't a dry eye in the place. Not even Adrian, who's generally pretty stoic, was a complete mess of tears. After the ceremony, Madeline returned the ring to me as we'd agreed. She put it in my hand and said, "Thank you, Mom, for sharing this with me, for letting me have Dad present today." I told her we'd always have her father present, that he was in her eyes that are exactly like Kenneth's, in her laugh that reminds me of him every day, in the way she tilts her head when she's thinking about something serious. Kenneth wasn't just in a ring, he was in everything we were and continued to be. Alice didn't show up at the wedding, to everyone's relief. Frederick told me afterward that she'd considered coming anyway, but finally decided to stay home. I don't know if it was out of shame after the scene at my house or because she finally understood she'd lost this battle, but I don't really care. The wedding was beautiful without her. Madeline was happy without her presence, and that was all that mattered. Now, several months after all this, Madeline and Adrian are building their life together. They come to dinner with me every 2 weeks. I'm teaching them some bakery recipes that Madeline wants to learn. Frederick and his family continue to be part of our lives. His kids call Madeline aunt and adore her. Alice is still alive, still difficult, but she's firmly outside our immediate circle. Frederick visits her because he feels it's his obligation as a son, but he maintains strict boundaries about what he tells her and how he lets her interact with his family. Sometimes I think about everything that happened and I wonder if I could have handled things differently, if I was too harsh with Madeline at the beginning, if I should have lent her the ring from the first moment without all the drama. But the truth is that all that conflict, as horrible as it was, forced us to have conversations we needed to have, to establish boundaries that should have existed for years, to confront Alice's toxicity in a way we'd never done. Kenneth always tried to keep the peace between his mother and me, always minimized Alice's hurtful comments, always asked me to be patient with her. And I did it out of love for him. But now that he's gone, I have no reason to continue tolerating that abuse. The ring is still on my finger, where it's been for more than 2 decades. Madeline has beautiful photos from the wedding where you can see the ring on her hand during the ceremony. She has that memory captured forever. And I still have the physical connection to Kenneth that I need to feel that part of him is still with me. In the end, we found a way for both of us to have what we needed, and our relationship is stronger now than before all this mess. I guess sometimes family crises, as painful as they are, end up showing you who's really on your side and what relationships are worth fighting to keep.